Hello, everyone. I'm Kenneth Morefield, the owner and operator of artsandfaith.com, and I'm pleased to welcome today Dr. Jennifer Bashaw. Uh, Dr. Bashaw is Associate Professor of New Testament and Christian Ministry at Campbell University, and she's here to lend us some wisdom and insight into the forthcoming movie, The Carpenter's Son. Dr. Bashaw also has a new book coming out from Broadleaf in January called Serving Up Scriptures: How to Read and Interpret the Bible for Yourself and Others. Dr. Bashaw, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So, the film The Carpenter's Son begins with a title card that says it's based on the apocryphal Gospel of Thomas. For those of us who have been a while since we took our Intro to Christian Studies class, uh, what is the apocryphal Gospel of Thomas?
Well, there's actually two different ones. One is just called the Gospel of Thomas,
Mhm,
and one is called the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. And the
mhm.
one that the movie is loosely based on is the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. So,
Okay.
yeah, so there's two. And the Gospel of Thomas, the regular one, is more of a sayings source. So it's like Jesus' sayings, and some of them um coincide with Matthew, Mark, Luke, a little bit in John. But the infancy gospel of Thomas is very different because it describes Jesus's childhood. And it doesn't really have a plot. It's hard to call it a narrative. They're just like little vignettes, little scenes from Jesus's early life. And it doesn't really fit together sort of cohesively. But that's the infancy gospel of Thomas. And that's
Mhm.
what shows up in this movie mostly.
Okay.
Yeah.
And by apocryphal, that means that
So
was
apocryphal
not
means that they are not in the canonical New Testament. So when the New Testament was solidified around 400 CE, they did not; those writings did not make it in there. So
okay.
apocryphal, yeah, that's what that means. And
So,
some are
mhm,
more uh, outlandish than others.
mhm.
The Infancy Gospel of Thomas is one of the maybe more outlandish ones.
Okay. So what do you mean by outlandish?
Um, in that there aren't a lot of people that would consider it to be an accurate representation of history. It's like it'll be
Okay.
described as fanciful or something like that by scholars.
So not necessarily lining up in detail or presentation to the gospels that are in the
Yes,
canonical.
almost not doesn't line up at almost at all. Like
Okay.
there's so few details in the infancy gospel of Thomas that line up with what's going on in the canonical gospels. Like
So,
maybe one
mhm.
little vignette it lines up, but yeah.
Interesting. So why do Christians, either scholars or lay people, um, read the apocryphal gospels, or should they?
Yeah, I think mostly the people who read them are scholars or maybe very educated pastors who will
Hmm.
do that, but they read it in order to sort of compare it to the canonical gospels, but also to kind of trace theological development throughout the early centuries of the church, because a lot of these apocryphal gospels are from the second and third centuries. So you can kind of see what different Christians were thinking and writing about in that early period
Hmm.
in Christian history. And so I think a lot of people read it for that reason. But my favorite description of the apocryphal writings from the second and third century is that they are compared to fan fiction.
Mm.
Like, so they take some themes and ideas and maybe even scenes from the canonical gospels, and then they just kind of spin off
Hmm.
into different stories, right? So I think that's a really good way to describe them as fanfic.
Hmm.
And then so people who read them, well, sometimes just for amusement, I would say, but also
Hmm.
to understand more about early Christians, and maybe it actually helps us see why certain books made it into the New Testament and why certain ones didn't, right?
Okay.
So canonical issues or canonization issues.
Okay. So turning more specifically towards the film, The Carpenter's Son, um, the it's gotten a lot of early controversial buzz. The director even reported getting death threats from internet trolls. Um, you've seen the film. Do you recommend the film for Christian audiences? Why or why not?
So I would recommend it for certain kinds of Christian
Kinds.
audiences,
Okay.
I would say.
That's a good
Generally
answer. Not all Christian audiences are the same.
Yeah, generally speaking, I think most Christians will find it maybe disturbing or upsetting. But I think people who are maybe familiar with the apocryphal gospels, or maybe more educated lay people and pastors, um, I would recommend it to them because it is a fascinating look into like some of the questions that the early church had about Jesus as a child, different like good and evil questions that may have been sort of floating around in the
Hmm.
early centuries. So I would recommend it in the same way that I would recommend people to watch like The Last Temptation of Christ from
Hmm.
many, many years ago. There are some artistic elements to it that help raise questions about good and evil and things like that. But it's definitely not made for Christian audiences. I remember people getting really upset when Last Temptation of Christ came out.
Yeah, there was actually a church that was, or I'm sorry, a movie theater that was firebombed in, set on
Oh,
fire in, I think it was France, and a couple people died, and yeah, definitely, and I think I'm old enough to have lived through that, so I remember there was a lot of boycott Universal, and people not buying the ET. That was the big thing when I was, you know, in high school and in the 80s, was don't buy the ET VHS because
right.
Universal put out Last Temptation.
Funny.
So uh, one of the things that I struggled with a little bit in the film was the relationship between Joseph, Mary, and Jesus, particularly the notion that Joseph seems uncertain as to whether or not, Jesus is from God or, from angels. How would you describe the relationship between Joseph, Mary, and Jesus in the film? And were there details that seemed more or less, you know, likely to, spur reactions from Christian audiences who are more
Right.
familiar with or more comfortable with canonical representations?
Yeah, I was fascinated by this actually. I think the portrayal of Mary is fairly consistent with the canonical gospels. I mean, it definitely goes beyond what's in there, but also in early church history, there was a kind of reverence of Mary and a focus on her love for Jesus and things like that. So that I thought was pretty good. The portrayal of Joseph is definitely different than the canonical Gospels, because
Hmm.
you don't get the feeling that that Joseph was like had a lot of doubts, or that he was pushing Jesus really hard, or you know um, sort of antagonistic towards Jesus. You don't get that feeling in the canonical gospels. But in the infancy gospel of Thomas, you do get that idea. It's
Hmm.
not super blatant, but you definitely feel like he's getting frustrated with Jesus because of what he's doing with his powers, and
Hmm.
things like that. So I think probably, I would say it is not biblically accurate, but
Hmm.
if you are trying to represent the infancy gospel of Thomas, then it falls in line with that. It's maybe a little more extreme than the infancy gospel of Thomas, but I think people would react negatively to the way that Joseph is portrayed here. But I think they would react even more negatively if they had portrayed Mary in a negative light. So I
Hmm.
think having this more sort of positive view of Mary works for the movie, but the negative portrayal of Joseph will probably raise some eyebrows, I bet.
So, um, sticking with that family dynamic for just a second, too, um, part of what I was wondering about is, aside from just whether or not it's consistent with canonical representations, a lot of times film representations tend to represent them as contemporary type Christians who are in that background. And so I was wondering how consistent maybe with your scholarship in um, you know, New Testament times, the dynamics are of a typical Jewish couple in the first century, or, as opposed to
Oh
the
yeah.
specific details of the biography in the
Hmm.
canonical gospels.
Yeah, I know. I don't think it's necessarily typical of how
Hmm.
Jewish families would be portrayed during that time. There does seem to be a little bit more of a modern family feel, like not the movie Modern Family, but I
Hmm.
mean not the show Modern Family, but like more modern, in as far as the way that Joseph treats Mary. I think he has a little bit of a reverence for her, it feels like.
Hmm.
Which, yeah, I don't think that would be a typical, dynamic in a Jewish
I think he
family.
says at one point to Jesus when they're arguing, like, you won't listen to me, but you listen to
Uh-huh.
her, and she
Uh-huh.
listens to me, you know.
Yes. Yeah, 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 yeah.
So that seemed to be very like a patriarchal vision, or he um to be frustrated at them not adapting a patriarchal, or Jesus not adopting a patriarchal sort of attitude towards the family dynamic.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think that was a little, yeah, that was a little interesting.
Hmm.
But there are other dynamics, I think, in the family that also don't necessarily fit into like a Jewish background. I mean, the way that Jesus was treated sort of like within the family, but then also people
Hmm.
looking at him. I do think that is a little more fantastical, because I think that children tended to be sort of more in the household.
Hmm.
And so they weren't out in public as much. And so
Hmm.
in the throughout the film, Jesus has this very public appearance,
Hmm.
that I don't think would have been the case in the ancient world. When he's an
Interesting.
adult walking around teaching, that's fine, but as
Mhm.
a child, not so much. Yeah.
Okay. So you mentioned in our pre-interview that you sometimes show film representations of Jesus, like Last Temptation, um, to your classes or to your students. How do they typically react when um, to films like you obviously haven't shown this one because it's not out yet, but to
Mhm.
films like Last Temptation, just looking at the sort of younger generation, college age Christians, how do they typically react to, representations of Jesus in film?
Well, in my Jesus and film class,
Hmm.
we start with the Gospels and read them and get a feel for the way that the Gospels portray Jesus. And so then we move into Jesus movies,
Hmm.
and then we do film analysis. And so I think they understand, they're a little more accepting of the
Hmm.
artistic elements in these movies. So we do watch scenes from Last Temptation. We don't watch the whole
The whole
thing.
thing. Okay.
I think if we watch the whole thing, there would be more people that are upset about it.
Hmm.
I tend to pick my scenes, and
Okay.
they do well with them. We in some cases will watch Jesus Christ Superstar the whole thing,
Hmm.
and they do pretty well with that. But again, they go into it thinking this is not a exact representation of the Gospels, right? They know
Hmm.
this is an artistic, evaluation of different sources, right? So they're usually okay with it. They don't get up in arms. I haven't had anybody quit my
Hmm.
class or
Okay.
complain or anything
Yeah.
about it like that.
So they seem to understand that it's an artistic representation and not an attempt to, you know, say this is who they seem to understand that it is an artistic representation and not assume.
Yeah, they do. Some of them do get uncomfortable. Like
Hmm.
they said they feel uncomfortable with particular portrayals of Jesus. I mean, especially in Last
Hmm.
Temptation. But I think that's fine, and they're able to
Yep.
articulate that. So
Yeah. So I'm just curious as an educator. I mean, I teach literature. Um, how do you try to respond when someone expresses discomfort, because I think as an educator, discomfort may not be a bad thing, you know,
Yeah.
um, but you want to handle it sensitively. So, like, how do you deal with a student who comes and says, "Wow, I was made uncomfortable by that"?
Yeah, usually I ask them, what about it makes you uncomfortable? And maybe why you think you feel uncomfortable, like from your past. Like, are there things that you've learned in
Mm,
church or from your family that is making this more uncomfortable? Like, just to pinpoint where it's at. And then to say, it's okay to feel uncomfortable. We come from, traditions and things like that. And it's good to know that we have those, especially when we're interacting with literature or art or anything like that. So, yeah.
okay, good. So one last question. In thinking through the sort of early responses or expectations for the film, I, I've noticed Christians have a tendency to throw out terms, and I've heard the term blasphemy used a lot, and I
Mhm.
realized, like, I'm not sure I know what that word means, or whether or not it applies to the film. Can you give us a biblical definition of blasphemy? And, can a work of art ever be considered blasphemous?
Mhm. Yeah, so the word blasphemy, or the concept in the Bible, it's hard to say that there is a biblical definition of blasphemy because it
Mm,
depends on, which book you're reading. It's never clearly defined. But of course, people bring the accusation of blasphemy against Jesus. So it seems to be something like saying something about God that is not true, or claiming something um, about God for yourself, because that's what
mm,
Jesus was doing when he was accused of blasphemy. So it's a pretty loose definition. And I think that probably today people pick up on that loose definition and mold it into whatever they want it to mean.
hmm
And so when they feel upset about something like a movie or a book or something like that, they'll hurl that word at it quickly, without really thinking about that. But do I think things today can be blasphemous? I wouldn't say that because
hmm
I again I don't have a strong definition of it even from the Bible to be able
Right.
to pinpoint that. But I imagine people will say that about this movie. So.
Well, so going back to something you said just now, like, if it's saying something that's not true,
Mhm.
um, I'm reminded of Sidney's defensive poetry, in which he had said, the artist doesn't claim it to be true in the same way that the historian does, or, that certainly in my classes, I teach literature, we can talk about the sort of literal surface level truth, and then, the truthfulness of the theme, or a truth that contemplation arrives at. But I wonder if sort of the working definition is saying something about God that isn't true, is your working definition, then it would be hard to call a film blasphemous unless you were a real expert interpreter of what the film is actually saying, what the film is
Right.
actually saying or claiming, particularly if it claims up front, hey, this is an apocryphal. This is not something we are saying is literal, that he literally said or literally did.
Yes.
But that thinking about it or imagining it in some way may help us reveal or understand truths
Mhm.
about the character or nature of God or the world that Jesus lived in,
Mhm.
without making claims about it is true that, Joseph. So that was actually very helpful for me. Um,
Mhm.
those are all the questions I had, Dr. Bashaw. Did you have anything else you wanted to say about the film?
Well, I just kept thinking that it did actually remind me of Last Temptation of Christ,
Mm,
because like there was this angst. So in Last Temptation, Jesus had this angst of trying to understand who he was and what was his mission and all of that. And then in this film, it seemed like it was Joseph that
hmm
was having all that angst. And so it had some parallels, I would say, and also some of the I guess if you would call them horror elements, reminded me of Last Temptation. I don't know if you remember, like
Yes.
Jesus puts his hand into his chest and pulls out his heart in Last Temptation.
Hmm.
You know, that kind of stuff. It just reminded me of Last Temptation when I was watching this film. So, you know, the artistic elements were interesting for sure.
Yeah, I'm not typically a horror film fan, but in comparing to Last Temptation, you're reminding me that, I mean, I've identified as Christian for almost half a century, you know, for 40 years, that for people who haven't read
Mm,
the canonical gospels, uh, they can run across things in them that just seem very strange and very weird. You know, this is my body, eat, eat it in
mhm,
remembrance of me. This is my blood. That, we sort of have heard so many times and become
mm,
familiar with. We're like, you know, don't really think about how strange or
mm,
even horrific that might appear to someone encountering it for or living it for the first
mm,
time. So um, that is an interesting sort of, I don't want to say justification, but rationale for the
mm.
horror element,
Yeah,
um, because um, because I think in times that we as modern Christians, you know, try to embrace the parts of it that make us comfortable
yeah.
and sort of shy away from or not think about the parts that might make us, you know, genuinely fearful or,
Mhm,
feel a dis-ease.
mhm.
Yeah, so that's a good word. Anything else you want to add about the film?
Oh, the one other thing I wanted to talk about was the portrayal of Satan.
Hmm.
I think that's probably where the horror part comes
Yeah.
in because I mean it feels like a lot of horror films are about demon possession or Satan or something like that. And so but it still didn't feel horror to me because I have been around the idea of Satan for a long time. I mean,
Hmm.
it's a particular portrayal of Satan for sure, but Satan comes up in the Old Testament, and then in the New Testament in different ways. And then we talk about it, I think, in church. And so that's why it didn't feel horror to me, like horror.
Hmm.
But I imagine to other people it would because it just falls in that line with demon possession and things like that. So,
Right. Well, and I do I thought about the representation of Satan, Satan. It it made me think about C.S. Lewis in the Screw Tape Letters and
yeah.
how the devil is like, we want even Christians, the Screw Tape says to Wormwood, we want even Christians to, when they hear devil, to think of a comic figure with a pitchfork. And so I do think that it is interesting sort of cultural work to portray Satan not as this sort of overly obvious that everyone takes one look at it and knows that he's the bad guy, but
Right.
actually seems a little bit more biblical in the sense of like,
Mhm.
no, you really have to pay attention to what he or she is saying, or
Mhm.
doing. You're not always gonna, Satan's not always going to appear with a big,
Yeah.
big flashing neon sign that says, you know, this is Satan and I'm here to
Yeah.
try to destroy you or destroy your faith.
Yeah.
So I did appreciate uh, the film's uh, dealing of the Satan figure in that way.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure, which is pretty consistent throughout Jesus film history. Like they
Mm,
portray Satan in so many different ways. Sometimes as a woman or a girl or
mm.
sometimes as like a person a man in a business suit or like there's all these different ways of portraying Satan. I think that's fascinating.
Excuse me. Um, all right. Well, great conversation. The movie is The Carpenter's Son, coming out from Magnolia later this month, November 2025. Dr. Bashaw, thank you so much for joining us and sharing a little bit of your background or expertise in New Testament and Christian studies. And thank you everyone for watching.